The courtroom in Fairview, a small American city nestled in the heart of the Midwest, pulsed with a quiet tension that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. The wooden benches, polished to a dull sheen by decades of anxious hands, creaked under the weight of onlookers, locals, reporters, and a few curious drifters who filled the gallery with a mix of anticipation and unease. At the defendant's table sat James Carter, a 35-year-old black man whose presence seemed to draw every eye in the room, though not for the reasons he deserved. His broad shoulders filled out a simple blue shirt, the sleeves slightly frayed. At the cuffs, paired with khaki pants that had seen better days. His hands rested calmly on the table, fingers interlaced, but his gaze remained fixed on the grain of the wood, as if studying its patterns could shield him from the whispers that buzzed like static around him. The charge against him disturbing. The piece at a corner store was so minor it bordered on absurd. A flimsy accusation that, in this room, had been twisted into something far more sinister. The air carried the weight of unspoken assumptions, of rumors that had taken root long before the truth could even get a foothold. James sat still, his silence not one of defeat, but of a man who knew the cost of speaking too soon. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a thud, and Sergeant John Carter, no relation to James, strode in, his police uniform pressed to a razor's edge, his boots clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. Tall, white, and square-jawed, John carried himself like a man who owned every room he entered, his eyes locking onto James with a smirk that didn't bother hiding its contempt. As he passed the defense table, he slowed just enough to lean in. His voice a low growl meant for James alone. "Didn't think you'd have the balls to show up." The words dripped with mockery, sharp enough to cut through the room's hum. James didn't move, didn't even blink, his eyes still tracing the wood grain, though a single, slow breath betrayed the discipline it took to stay still. The front row caught the exchange, their heads tilting slightly, but no one spoke. The room was a pressure cooker, and John was turning up the heat. Judge Margaret Evans, woman in her late 50s with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room from her elevated bench. Her lips were a thin line, her eyes sharp and unyielding, carrying a judgment that seemed to settle on James before a single word of testimony had been spoken. She didn't need to say anything. Her posture, the slight tilt of her head, spoke volumes. Emily Harper, James's public defender, leaned closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let me do the talking," she said, her tone steady but laced with an urgency that betrayed her awareness of the odds stacked against them. A young lawyer, her dark hair tied back and her suit slightly too big for her frame, Emily was fighting a battle she knew was uphill. James' lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "You think they're here for the truth?" he murmured, his voice low and calm, but carrying a weight that made Emily pause. She didn't answer, her eyes flicking to the gallery, where whispers were already weaving a narrative that painted James as a threat, a troublemaker, a man who didn't belong in their quiet town. From the press row, Michael Reed, a young reporter, with a notebook balanced on his knee, watched the scene unfold with a curiosity that's grind of his profession hadn't yet dulled. His pen hovered over the page, his eyes narrowing as he caught something no one else seemed to notice. James' right hand, almost unconsciously, drifted to a long, pale scar running along his wrist. His fingers pressed there for a moment, then stilled, as if grounding himself in a memory no one else in the room could access. Michael scribbled a single word in his notebook. Why? The question lingered in his mind, a thread he couldn't yet pull, but one that felt heavier than the routine court stories he'd covered before. There was something about James's stillness, his restraint, that didn't align with the picture John was trying to paint. The side door creaked open, and Daniel Brooks, the court clerk, stepped in with a stack of files clutched against his chest. A wiry man in his 40s, Daniel moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years blending into the background of Fairview's legal system. But as his eyes fell on James, something shifted, a flicker of recognition, quick and sharp, before he forced his gaze away. The files slipped slightly in his grip, one tumbling to the floor with a thud that echoed in the tense room. He scrambled to pick it up, his movements too quick, too loud, drawing a few curious glances. Daniel busied himself at his desk, but his fingers trembled faintly as he sorted through the papers as if he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. Michael noticed, his pen pausing again. Another note added, "Clerk knows something." The room seemed to amplify every sound, the shuffle of shoes on the floor, the faint squeak of a bench as someone shifted their weight, the low hum of the air vent overhead. It wasn't just the sounds, it was the way people sat, their spines straighter when James moved even slightly, their eyes darting to John for cues, as if he were the arbiter of what was true. John cleared his throat and stepped to the witness stand, leaning into the microphone with the confidence of a man who believed the room existed to hear him. "When I approached the defendant," he began, his voice crisp and deliberate, "he was agitated, belligerent, the kind of guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him." He glanced at James, his lips curling slightly. "People like that, you never know when they'll snap." The words landed like stones, heavy with implication. People like that wasn't just a phrase. It was a code, and everyone in the room understood it. James sat perfectly still, his hands clasped, thumbs pressed so tightly the knuckles whitened. But his gaze remained on the table, unmoved by the venom in John's voice. Emily was on her feet before John could continue. "Objection, Your Honor," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "There's no evidence my client was violent. This is prejudicial." Judge Evans didn't look up from her notes, her pen scratching across the page. "Overruled," she said flatly, her tone as dismissive as her earlier glance. Emily's jaw tightened, but she sat slowly, muttering under her breath, "For the record, we're not letting that slide." John continued, his testimony a carefully crafted portrait of James as a volatile figure, each word painting him as a man on the edge of chaos. He spoke of erratic behavior, a threatening stance, conveniently omitting that James had been standing in line to buy a coffee when the alleged incident occurred. The gallery listened, some nodding, others whispering, the narrative taking hold like wildfire. As John stepped down from the stand, he didn't return to his seat. Instead, he took the long route past the defense table, his boots deliberately slow. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he muttered, his voice low enough to evade the judge's ear, but clear to James and Emily. James didn't react. His breathing steady 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, a rhythm that spoke of years spent mastering control. Emily whispered, "Ignore him," but John wasn't done. As he passed, his boot shot out, fast and sharp, connecting with James' shin under the table. The sound was muffled, a dull thud, but it was enough to make a woman in the second row gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Emily shot up again, her voice cutting through the room. "Your Honor, the arresting officer just assaulted my client in open court." Judge Evans set her pen down with a deliberate slowness, her eyes narrowing. "Sit down, Ms. Harper, or—" "I'll clear this courtroom," she said, her voice cold as steel. "Oh, the record will reflect what I say it reflects. Move on." Michael's camera clicked twice, rapid and discreet, capturing John's fleeting smirk and James' unshaken composure. Through his lens, the contrast was stark arrogance against restraint. A moment frozen in time that felt like the spark of something bigger. James' hand drifted to the scar on his wrist again, pressing briefly before stilling. He lifted his head, his eyes locking onto John's for the briefest moment, a calm so piercing it seemed to unsettle the officer. John's grin faltered. Just for a second, like a man who'd heard an unexpected sound in a dark alley. Emily leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "We'll file it. We'll get it on the record properly." James gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. His gaze returning to the table. Judge Evans tapped her pen twice, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and stood. "We'll take a brief recess," she announced, her tone clipped. The benches creaked. As the gallery exhaled, conversation sparking in hushed tones. John adjusted his sleeve as if nothing had happened, but the shift in the room was undeniable. A line had been crossed, witnessed by all, and though no one could know it yet, it was the first crack in a foundation that was about to crumble. Michael scribbled another note, his pen moving faster now, sensing a story that was no longer just about a minor charge. Daniel Brooks slipped toward the side door, his phone already in hand, his steps quick and purposeful. As the door closed, behind him, he dialed a number, his voice low but urgent. "It's him," he said. "I'm sure of it. You need to get here now." Outside, the late morning sun cast long shadows across Fairview's quiet streets. But inside, the air was thick with the promise of something unstoppable, and James Carter sat at the center of it, silent, steady, waiting for the moment he knew was coming. The recess in Fairview's courthouse stretched the air thin, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with fragmented conversations, a mosaic of whispers that curled like smoke through the marble corridors. "Herdy's ex-military," a woman murmured near the water fountain, her voice low but carrying just far enough to spark curious glances. "Nonsense," another voice countered. "He's just stirring trouble." The words hung, mingling with the faint scent of old coffee and polished wood, as clusters of onlookers locals with folded arms. Reporters clutching notepads cast sidelong looks toward James Carter. He stood alone against a wall, hands loosely clasped, his posture relaxed, but his eyes fixed on a distant point down the hall, as if seeing something no one else could. His blue shirt was slightly wrinkled now, the morning's tension settling into the fabric, but his calm was unshaken, a quiet anchor in the swelling tide of speculation. Sergeant John Carter leaned against a marble pillar, his police badge glinting. Under the fluorescent lights, his smirk a deliberate performance for the small crowd gathered nearby. "If this guy's a hero," he drawled, loud enough for heads to turn, "then I'm running for governor." A few chuckles rippled from his buddies, their laughter sharp and fleeting, like sparks off a flint. But the hallway's energy was shifting, the whispers growing sharper, more pointed. A man in a worn jacket muttered to his neighbor, "Something's off. That cop's pushing too hard." John's eyes flicked toward the sound, his jaw tightening, but he kept his pose casual, as if the hallway were his stage and he the undisputed star. Emily Harper, James's public defender, paced a few feet away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She stopped beside James, her voice low but urgent. "They're talking about you," she said, tilting her head toward the knot of onlookers. "Is there something I should know?" James didn't meet her gaze, his eyes still locked on that invisible point down the hall. "It's complicated," he replied, his voice soft but edged, like a door closing gently but firmly. Emily studied him, her brows furrowing as she tried to read the tension in his jaw, the faint lines etched around his eyes. She wanted to press further, but before she could, Daniel Brooks, the court clerk, appeared at her side. His face was tight, his usual unobtrusive demeanor replaced by something sharper, more purposeful. "I made a call," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "You'll see." Emily's eyes narrowed. "What call?" she asked, but Daniel was already stepping away, pulling his phone from his pocket, as if the conversation had never happened. Across the hall, Michael Reed crouched over his camera. his fingers flying across the screen as he reviewed the photos he'd taken. John's boots striking James' shin. The officer's fleeting smirk, James' unshaken stillness. The images were raw, unfiltered, the kind that could stop a newsroom in its tracks. He typed a quick message to his editor. Assault in open court. Going live soon. His pulse was steady, but his jaw was tight, the weight of what he was about to unleash settling over him. These photos weren't just evidence. They were a spark that could ignite a firestorm. He glanced at James, who shifted his weight slightly, his gaze now scanning the hallway as if sensing a change before anyone else could. The glass doors at the far end of the corridor swung open, letting in a slice of midday light that cut through the dim fluorescence. A man stepped through, not in uniform, but in dark slacks and a pressed jacket that hung with a precision that spoke of discipline. His eyes swept the hallway, sharp and assessing, until they landed on James. For a moment, their gazes locked, and the stranger's posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a soldier recognizing a brother in arms. James' brow lifted a fraction, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. The man gave a nearly imperceptible nod before turning down a side corridor, his steps silent but purposeful. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, but it didn't go unnoticed. Emily caught it, her breath catching slightly. Michael's camera lowered, his eyes narrowing as he jotted a quick note. Who was that? Even John saw it, though he masked his unease with a sarcastic grin. Muttering to a nearby officer, "What's next? A secret agent?" The hallway grew tighter, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Conversations faltered, replaced by the echo of footsteps and the faint clack of a clerk's typewriter from a nearby office hand, outdated sound that underscored the mounting tension. Michael slipped his phone back into his pocket, his eyes still on James. "This story's about to blow up," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. John, restless now, pushed off the pillar and started toward James, his boots deliberately loud. "So, Navy SEAL, huh?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Or maybe you just went to some boot camp and learned how to look tough." James' gaze lifted slowly, locking onto John's with a calm that felt like a blade. No words, just a steady, unyielding look that made John's next insult die in his throat. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, until the bailiff's voice cut through from the courtroom doors. "Court reconvenes in 5 minutes." The crowd began to shuffle back inside, but the energy had shifted, like the air before a lightning strike. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken, her mind racing over Daniel's cryptic words. Michael adjusted his camera, his instincts telling him something big was coming. James eased back into his chair at the defense table, his posture loose, but his gaze steady, as if he were the eye of a storm no one else could see. John lingered in the aisle, standing a moment too long, his fingers twitching at his side as if searching for the control he could feel slipping away. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable, every sound amplified, the creak of the benches, the rustle of papers, the faint hum of the overhead lights. John didn't return to his seat right away. Instead, he slipped through a side door, his movements quick and purposeful, like a man who needed to make something happen before the tide turned against him. Michael caught the movement, his pen pausing as he noted it in his book. John wasn't headed for the restroom. He was moving toward the judge's chambers, his shoulders squared, his stride too deliberate to be casual. Through a narrow window in the alcove, Michael glimpsed him speaking to Judge Evans, his gestures sharp and insistent. "A guy like that," John's voice carried faintly. "You don't let him drag this out. He's trouble, Judge. Let's wrap this up clean." Evans didn't nod, but she didn't dismiss him either. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the cost of letting John have his way. It was enough for Jana's silent permission. No paper trail needed. Back in the courtroom, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped aside, her brow furrowing as she read the message. No name, no number, just 5 words. They're coming. Hold your ground. Her pulse spiked, her eyes darting to James, who sat unmoved, his hands resting calmly on the table. She didn't tell him about the text, not yet. But her fingers tightened around her pen, her mind racing to piece together what was happening. The doors swung open again, and John re-entered. Not walking, but prowling, his chin tilted up. His shoulders set like a man who believed he could bend the world to his will. He stopped beside James, close enough that their shadows overlapped. His voice low and venomous. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for the front row to hear. Another loudmouth who thinks the world owes him something. A man in the gallery stiffened, his hand twitching as if ready to intervene. John's eyes flicked toward him, daring a reaction before he continued. "Guys like you end up where you belong, behind bars, or worse." The air shifted, heavy with the weight of a moment about to break. John was fishing for a reaction. A spark he could fan into proof that James was the threat he'd painted. But James didn't bite. He tilted his head slowly, his voice low and steady, cutting deeper than any shout. "Your time's almost up," he said, not a threat but a fact, delivered with the certainty of a man who knew the script's ending. John's smirk flickered, a crack in his armor, but he covered it with a scoff, stepping back as if to dismiss the moment. Emily saw it, her pen pausing mid-note. Michael saw it too, his camera ready, his instincts screaming that the story was about to turn. Then it happened. A sharp, jarring ring from the clerk's desk phone sliced through the room like a blade. Every head turned, the sound almost offensive in its intrusion. Sarah Mitchell, the clerk, picked up the receiver, her glasses slipping slightly as she listened. "Superior Court Clerk's Office," she said, her voice steady at first. 3 seconds later, her posture stiffened, her eyes locking onto James with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "Yes. One moment," she said softly, covering the receiver. She looked at Judge Evans. "Your Honor, urgent call. Department of Defense. They're asking for you by name." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a collective intake of breath. Evans' brows pulled together, her skepticism clear. "This is a court proceeding," she said, her tone sharp. Sarah hesitated, then pressed. "They insist. It's about the defendant." The room went silent, save for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. Evans reached for the phone, her movements slow, deliberate, as if to prove she wasn't rattled. "This is Judge Evans," she said, her voice crisp. As she listened, her composure began to crack, her hand tightened on the receiver. Her eyes flicking to James, then back to her desk. "You're certain?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost strained. James sat still, but something in. His posture shifted, a subtle straightening of his shoulders, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Yes, I understand," Evans said, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We'll accommodate." She hung up, her hand lingering on the phone. Her face unreadable, but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. John folded his arms, letting out a low chuckle. "What's next? A UFO landing?" he muttered, but his bravado was hollow, his jaw tight. Emily shot him a look that could have cut glass, her fingers curling around her notepad. Evans stood, her voice regaining its authority, but carrying a new edge. "Court will recess," she said, the word heavier this time. The bailiff blinked, starting to protest, but she cut him off with a glare. Benches scraped as people stood, confusion mixing with curiosity. Michael leaned toward Emily, his voice low. "That wasn't just any call." She didn't answer, her eyes still on James, who remained seated, his calm unshaken, but his gaze now carrying a glint of certainty. The back of the room, Daniel Brooks slipped toward the side door, his phone in hand, typing quickly. His thumb hesitated for a moment before pressing send. On his screen, the message was brief. "They're here." Outside, the faint rumble of a vehicle engine grew louder, a deep, throaty sound that didn't belong to Fairview's usual traffic. The courtroom doors remained closed, but the air inside was electric, charged with the sense that something unstoppable was about to break through. James didn't move, didn't speak, but the faintest curve of his lips suggested he knew exactly what was coming. And for the first time that day, the balance of power was no longer in John's hands. The courtroom doors in Fairview's courthouse burst open, unleashing a torrent of noise and motion that spilled into the marble hallway like water breaking a dam. Reporters surged forward, their voices a chaotic symphony of shouted questions. Microphones thrusting through the air like spears. "Mr. Carter, do you have a statement? Is it true you're a Navy SEAL? Was Officer Carter targeting you because of your race?" Camera shutters fired in staccato bursts, their flashes painting James Carter's face in stark, flickering light. The air carried the sharp tang of overheated electronics, mingling with the faint must of old paper and the nervous sweat of a crowd hungry for answers. James moved through the frenzy with measured steps, his blue shirt now clinging slightly. To his broad shoulders, the weight of the day etched into its creases. Behind him, Admiral Robert Hayes followed, his Navy dress uniform a quiet declaration of authority, his presence parting the crowd like a ship cutting through waves. James didn't shield his eyes from the lights or duck his head. His gaze was steady, his expression not one of triumph, but of resolve. A man who'd walked through fire and emerged whole. A young reporter, her ponytail bouncing as she jostled for position, shoved her microphone toward James. "What do you want people to take away from what happened today?" she asked, her voice cutting through the din. James paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, reporters with pens poised, locals whispering behind their hands, a teenager in the back filming with his phone. The hallway seemed to hold its breath, the chaos softening for a moment. "Doing the right thing," he said, his voice low but clear. Each word deliberate. "Isn't about what's easy. It's about what's necessary." The simplicity of it landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the crowd. He didn't wait for follow-ups, turning toward the glass doors where a black SUV idled at the curb. Admiral Hayes guided him forward, the military police officers clearing a narrow path through the throng. The SUV's door opened and James climbed in, Hayes following. The door shut with a solid thud, muffling the clamor outside, leaving the reporters grasping at echoes. Inside the SUV, the world quieted to the low hum of the engine and the faint buzz of Fairview's afternoon traffic. James leaned back, his eyes drifting to the window as the city blurred past in streaks of gray concrete and golden sunlight. His reflection stared back, older than the young SEAL in the faded photos from his past, the lines around his eyes deeper, etched by years of silent burdens. Fairview's streets unfolded, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, kids chasing each other in a park. A woman pushing a stroller lives untouched by the storm that had just swept through the courthouse. James' gaze softened, a faint weight lifting from his shoulders. He didn't need the city to know his story, didn't need their applause or their headlines. What he needed was the quiet certainty that, for today, justice had clawed its way to the surface, raw and undeniable. Back at the courthouse, Emily Harper stood on the steps, her suit jacket now slung over her arm, her dark hair loosening from its tight bun. She exhaled slowly, her lips curving into a small, restrained smile, not of victory, but of relief. A quiet pride in having stood her ground against a system that had seemed rigged from the start. She'd fought for James, not just as his lawyer, but as someone who'd seen the truth beneath the lies, And that fight had mattered. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, already buzzing about the case, but she ignored them, her eyes lingering on the spot where the SUV had disappeared. The weight of the day settled over her, not heavy, but grounding. A reminder of why she'd chosen this path despite its bruises. Michael Reed remained on the steps, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his camera still warm from use. He'd stayed silent during the press frenzy, letting the louder voices drown each other out while he watched James until the SUV vanished around a corner. His laptop screen glowed with the draft of his article. The headline, stark: Officer arrested for assaulting Navy SEAL in Fairview court. The photos, Jan's boot striking James, the officer's smug grin. James' unshaken calm were already with his editor, set to go live within the hour. Michael closed the laptop gently, almost reverently, and muttered to himself, "This isn't just a story. It's a reckoning." His pulse thrummed with the knowledge that his work would ripple beyond Fairview, forcing people to confront truths they'd rather ignore. But there was a weight to it, to a flicker of unease about the backlash that might follow, the ugly comments already brewing online. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the clarity of the moment, the rare feeling of having captured something real inside the courtroom. Now empty save for a few lingering clerks, Judge Margaret Evans sat at her bench, her gavel untouched, her glasses resting on the desk. The weight of the day pressed against her, her earlier dismissals now a bitter taste in her mouth. She'd leaned too hard on routine, on the comfort of assumptions. And the Department of Defense's intervention had exposed that misstep in a way she couldn't ignore. Her fingers traced the edge of a file, her eyes distant as she replayed the moment Admiral Hayes had placed that leather folder before her, its contents dismantling the narrative she'd let John Carter build. She wouldn't admit it aloud, but the shift in the room had shaken her, a crack in the authority she'd wielded so confidently. The silence of the courtroom felt heavier now, almost accusatory, and for the first time in years. She wondered if she'd misjudged more than just this case. Outside, Fairview was waking up to itself in a new way. The news was spreading first, in whispers at the diner across the street, then in texts pinged between neighbors, then in the first online posts that lit up local forums. "Did you hear about the guy at the courthouse? Hey, they say he's a hero. That cop got what he deserved." The city, with its quiet streets and tidy lawns, had always prided itself on order, but now that order was being questioned. A woman at the grocery store paused my dial. Her phone opened to Michael's breaking story, her brow furrowing as she read about James' past. A group of teenagers at the skate park traded rumors, their voices a mix of awe and disbelief. Fairview wasn't a place accustomed to upheaval, but the day's events had planted a seed, one that might grow into something the town couldn't yet name. Daniel Brooks, the clerk who'd set the wheels in motion, sat in his small office off the courtroom, his phone dark now, his work done. He'd recognized James from a fleeting memory, a name mentioned years ago in a hushed conversation with a friend in the Navy, a story of a mission so classified it was more legend than fact. When he'd seen James in the defendant's chair, the pieces had clicked, and his call to an old contact had been a gamble that paid off. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips, not of pride, but of satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing you've tipped the scales just enough to matter. He wouldn't be in the headlines, wouldn't be quoted in Michael's article, but that was fine. Some acts of justice didn't need a spotlight. Across town, in a holding cell at the county jail, John Carter sat on a metal bench, his uniform replaced by a plain gray jumpsuit, his badge confiscated. The reality of his situation was sinking in, the metallic click of the handcuffs still echoing in his mind. He'd thought he was untouchable, a fixture in Fairview's small world. But the weight of a federal offense assaulting a protected witness had shattered that illusion. His jaw clenched as he replayed the moment the military police had moved in, their movements swift and unyielding, no room for his protests. He tried to laugh it off, to call it a mistake, but the look in James' ice-calm, certain, cutting had silenced him. Now, alone in the cell, he felt the walls closing in, not just the concrete ones, but the consequences of his arrogance. He muttered to himself, "This can't stick," but the words felt hollow. A desperate grasp at a reality that no longer existed. Back in the SUV, Admiral Hayes sat beside James, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the road ahead. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The bond between them, forged in the crucible of missions long past, was enough. James' hand rested on his knee, the scar on his wrist catching a glint of sunlight through the window. That scar, a relic of a night in a desert far from Fairview, was a reminder of what he'd carried, what he'd survived. He didn't talk about it, not with Hayes, not with anyone, but it was part of the weight that kept him steady, the anchor, that had held him through the courtroom storm. The SUV turned onto a quiet street, the courthouse now a distant memory, its steeple fading into the skyline. James let out a slow breath, one he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and with it came a release, not of tension, but of certainty. Justice wasn't just a word in a law book. It was the quiet strength of those who stood for it, no matter the cost. The city moved on around him, its rhythm unbroken. A man watered his lawn, the spray catching the light in a fleeting rainbow. A delivery truck rumbled past, its driver oblivious to the story unfolding just blocks away. Fairview would keep turning, its days blending into one another. But something had shifted. James' story, now spilling across news feeds and whispered in coffee shops, was a crack in the town's facade, a challenge to its easy assumptions. It wasn't just about one man or one courtroom. It was about the courage to stand firm, to demand truth in the face of lies. Michael's article would hit the wires soon, its words carrying James' quiet resolve to a world beyond Fairview's borders. Emily would return to her office, her resolve strengthened for the next fight. Daniel would file his papers, his small role in the day's events a secret he'd carry with quiet pride as the SUV merged onto the highway. James' gaze lingered on the horizon, where the last of the afternoon sun burned gold. He didn't need Fairview to remember him, didn't need its validation. What he needed, what he'd always needed, was the knowledge that he'd stood his ground. Not for glory, but for what was right. The road stretched ahead, open and unending, and in that moment, James felt the weight of the day lift, replaced by a clarity that felt like freedom. Justice, he thought, wasn't just written in laws or won in courtrooms. It was carried in the hearts of those willing to fight for it, to hold the line when everything else tried to pull them under. The story of that day in Fairview wasn't just about what happened, was about what it left behind. A reminder that truth could be buried, but never erased. That courage could be quiet, but never weak. And that justice, when it came, could change the way a town, or even a world, saw itself. If this story resonates, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every voice matters. Every truth deserves its moment. And every step toward justice is a step worth taking.